He was born in Philadelphia, in the chill of a late August morning, when dreams were louder than the streets outside. The boy who would become a legend learned to dribble before he could tie his shoes. His first court nothing more than cracked asphalt behind a small house, where every bounce echoed like a promise. Every shot whispered a future that only he could see. His father, Joe Jellybean Bryant, had once danced across the same game. The son studied him, imitated him, then surpassed him in ways that would reshape basketball forever. Italy became home for a time, a young American boy chasing sunsets across Tuscan skies, learning language, discipline, and a European sophistication that would later distinguish him from his peers. He spoke softly but played fiercely, and even then, there was something in his eyes, a fire, a silence, a certainty that destiny was not something you waited for, but something you seized with both hands. When he returned to the United States at 17, he carried Europe in his heart, an ambition coursing through his veins. At an age when most boys were worried about prom dates and college applications, Kobe Bean Bryant faced the world's brightest lights and said, with the quiet confidence that would define his career, that he was ready for whatever came next. He skipped college, walked directly into the storm of the NBA with nothing but courage and a smile that suggested he knew secrets about success that others had yet to discover. Los Angeles welcomed him like destiny fulfilled. The lights were too bright for most teenagers, the pressure too intense, the expectations too overwhelming. But not for Kobe. He was smooth, electric, unpredictable. He played not just to win, but to perfect every movement, every decision, every moment on the court. He studied Michael Jordan like scripture, analyzing every game, every interview, every gesture, then wrote his own gospel in purple and gold. As the Mamba slowly awakened within him, 41 years after that August morning in Philadelphia, that same boy sat across from Oprah Winfrey in the warm golden glow of Harpo Studios. The restless energy that had once defined Kobe Bryant's every movement, the constant motion of hands that couldn't stay still, the eyes that were always calculating angles and advantages, had settled into something deeper, more peaceful. He wore a simple gold Lakers hoodie that connected him to the franchise where he had spent his entire 20-year career, but his hands rested calmly in his lap, no longer in constant motion, with the competitive fire that had driven him to 5 championships, 18 all-star selections, and a place among basketball's immortals. Behind wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance, his dark eyes held the depth of someone who had traveled to the furthest reaches of human achievement and discovered that the most important victories happen not in sold-out arenas with 80,000 screaming fans, but in quiet moments that went unwitnessed and unrecorded. Teaching his daughter, Gianna, how to perfect her footwork in their backyard court, reading bedtime stories to his younger daughters until they fell asleep in his arms, finding joy in the simple rhythm of a basketball, bouncing in the pre-dawn darkness of an empty gym, where only he and his thoughts existed. The familiar burgundy and cream warmth of Harpo Studios felt different with this version of Kobe Bryant as a guest. The circular arrangement of seats, the soft lighting designed to create intimacy, the carefully positioned cameras that had captured thousands of conversations between Oprah and the world's most compelling figures. All of it seemed to recognize that something unprecedented was happening. 300 audience members sensed they weren't looking at the intense, driven athlete who had once demanded perfection from himself, and everyone around him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. This was a man transformed, someone who had learned to channel that same focused energy into entirely different pursuits: storytelling, mentoring, fatherhood, discovering that the discipline which had made him one of basketball's greatest players could create meaning in ways that transcended sports entirely. The studio itself seemed to hold its breath as the cameras rolled. The warm golden lights that Oprah had used for decades to create an atmosphere of trust and revelation cast everything in a glow that suggested this conversation would be different, more important, somehow final, in ways that no one fully understood yet. The familiar The Oprah Winfrey Show logo glowed softly in the background, but the attention was completely focused on the two people sitting in those iconic chairs, separated by a small table, holding two glasses of water that would remain largely untouched throughout their conversation. Oprah sat in her signature chair, wearing a deep burgundy silk blouse that projected both authority and maternal warmth. Her posture was attentive, but relaxed, leaning slightly forward in the way that had made millions of guests feel heard and understood over the years. Over 2 decades of conversations with icons, from world leaders to pop stars, from authors to activists, had taught her to recognize when someone had truly evolved rather than simply aged. And everything about Kobe's presence suggested a man who had successfully navigated the treacherous transition from proving himself to improving others, from pursuing personal greatness to creating environments where others could discover their own extraordinary potential. It was December 2019, just weeks before the helicopter accident that would end his life and transform him from a retired basketball player into an eternal symbol of dedication, transformation, and the complex relationship between ambition and authenticity. The date would later seem prophetic to those who watched the interview, as if something in the universe had arranged this final opportunity for Kobe to share his evolved understanding of success, legacy, and what it means to live a life of significance beyond personal achievement. But in this moment, observers could see only a man who had found peace after decades of internal and external battles, someone who understood that his greatest achievements might still lie ahead in forms he was only beginning to explore. There was a calmness about him that was new, a settled quality that suggested he had finally made peace with the various versions of himself. The driven teenager who had announced his NBA intentions, the young superstar who had sometimes struggled with teammates and coaches, the mature champion who had learned to lead through example rather than demand. The conversation began where most Kobe Bryant interviews began, with basketball, questions about his 5 championships, his legendary work ethic, his relationship with teammates like Shaquille O'Neal, and his famous Mamba Mentality approach to continuous improvement. These were familiar topics that Kobe had discussed hundreds of times over the years, responses that he could deliver smoothly and professionally while revealing little of his inner world. But those who watched carefully could sense that he had come to discuss something far deeper than athletic achievements. When Oprah asked about his transformation since retirement, something shifted in his posture, his expression, his entire energy. The competitive mask that had protected him for 2 decades slipped away, revealing someone who had spent considerable time reflecting on identity, purpose, and the challenge of growing beyond the role that had defined most of his adult life. He spoke about the hardest part of retirement for any athlete, learning who you are when you're not competing. For 20 years, he explained, his identity had been crystal clear. He was a basketball player whose job was to win championships and perfect his craft. Everything else in his life had been organized around that singular identity: his sleep schedule, his diet, his relationships, his daily routines. All of it had served the goal of basketball excellence. But retirement had forced him to confront fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and self-worth. When external validation was no longer available through scoreboards and statistics, the audience listened with unusual intensity as he described the transition from being someone who had to prove his worth through performance to someone who could simply exist, create, and love without the constant pressure of public judgment. Observers could see the relief in his shoulders, the lightness in his voice when he talked about mornings, when he woke up and chose how to use his time, rather than having every moment scheduled around games, practices, and media obligations. There was a freedom in his movements that hadn't been there during his playing days, when every gesture had been analyzed, every expression scrutinized for clues about his mood, his relationships with teammates, his thoughts about upcoming games. When the conversation turned to fatherhood, the transformation was visible and immediate. His entire demeanor changed, his expression softening in a way that revealed the man behind the competitive facade that had dominated his public persona for so long. His hands, which had remained still during the basketball discussion, began to move slightly as he talked about his daughters, gesturing in ways that showed how deeply this topic engaged his emotions. Those watching could see that this wasn't the calculated media response of an athlete protecting his image. This was genuine emotion from someone who had discovered that love isn't something you earn through performance, but something you give and receive simply by showing up authentically. The cameras captured the way his eyes lit up when he mentioned his daughters' names, the pride that filled his voice when he talked about their individual personalities and achievements, the protective tenderness that showed in his expression when he discussed their futures. He described how his daughters didn't love him because he had won 5 championships or scored 81 points in a single game, achievements that had made him famous around the world, but meant nothing in the context of bedtime stories and homework help. They loved him because he read them stories with different voices for each character, because he helped them with math problems with patience rather than demanding immediate understanding, because he was present for the small moments that made up their daily lives. School pickups, soccer games, family dinners, where basketball was never mentioned. When he talked about Gianna, his second oldest daughter who had fallen in love with basketball, observers could see pride mixed with something deeper, the recognition that teaching could be even more fulfilling than performing. The way he described her developing skills, her growing understanding of the game, her unique approach to playing basketball, revealed a father who was genuinely excited about his daughter's potential rather than trying to live vicariously through her achievements. The cameras captured the way his hands moved slightly when he described watching Gianna master a move they had been working on together, the satisfaction that filled his voice when he talked about seeing her develop confidence and leadership skills through sports. But more than that, those who knew Kobe's history could recognize this as perhaps the most significant evolution of his famous Mamba mentality. From using it to dominate opponents, to using it to nurture potential in others. He explained to Oprah that coaching Gianna had taught him that the best mentorship isn't about imposing your will or methods on someone else. Instead, it requires understanding their unique strengths and helping them develop those strengths in their own way. Gianna played basketball differently than he had, and that difference was beautiful rather than disappointing. She wasn't trying to be Kobe Bryant. She was trying to be the best version of Gianna Bryant, and that distinction seemed to bring him more joy than any individual achievement from his playing career. The conversation shifted to his post-basketball creative projects, and again observers could see the excitement that had once been reserved for fourth-quarter comebacks and playoff victories, now directed towards storytelling, writing, and content creation. His Granity Studios production company, his children's books, his animated films, all of these represented a completely different form of excellence, one that required the same discipline and attention to detail that had made him a great basketball player, but applied to entirely different challenges. He described how throughout his career, he had been telling stories through basketball, narratives about perseverance, about overcoming obstacles, about the beauty of dedication and hard work. Every game had been a story with heroes and villains, rising action and climax, triumph and defeat. Every season had been a chapter in a larger narrative about what becomes possible when you commit completely to something you love. But basketball stories, he explained, only reached basketball fans. His creative work, books, films, animated projects, allowed him to explore universal themes like mentorship, imagination, and personal development in ways that could reach children, parents, anyone trying to figure out how to pursue their dreams while maintaining their values and relationships. The audience could sense his desire for his daughters to see that creativity and achievement weren't limited to one domain, that the same principles creating excellence in sports could create excellence in art, business, or any field they chose to pursue. He wanted them to understand that their father was more than a former basketball player. He was someone who continued to grow, create, and challenge himself, even after his primary career had ended. When Oprah asked about fear, something many would find incongruous for someone who had built a career on fearless performance under pressure, his response revealed the depth of his ongoing self-examination. He spoke about being afraid of wasting the platform he had been given, afraid of becoming so comfortable in retirement that he stopped challenging himself to grow, learn, and contribute something meaningful to the world. Those watching could see the competitive fire that had driven his basketball career, redirected toward a different kind of excellence. The fear that his daughters might grow up thinking success meant reaching a certain level of achievement and then coasting. He wanted them to understand that real success was continuous growth, continuous service to others, continuous effort to become better than you were yesterday. He addressed the camera directly when he talked about people misunderstanding Mamba mentality as simply being aggressive or competitive in sports. The real Mamba mentality, he explained, was about approaching everything in your life with curiosity, with dedication, with the understanding that mastery is a journey rather than a destination. This philosophy could be applied to fatherhood, to creative work, to any pursuit that required sustained effort and continuous improvement. But perhaps most revealing was his admission of being afraid that he wouldn't have enough time to teach everything he wanted to teach, create everything he wanted to create, be present for all the moments with his family that he recognized as precious and irreplaceable. The audience could sense something prophetic in this concern, an urgency that suggested an awareness of mortality that went beyond typical midlife reflection. There was something in his tone, in the way he lingered on certain words, that suggested he understood time differently now, that each moment carried additional weight because he had learned to measure life in experiences rather than achievements. When Oprah asked the question that would become the most memorable moment of the interview, "Are you happy now, Kobe?" the studio fell into complete silence. The question seemed to catch him off guard, not because he hadn't considered it, but because it required him to synthesize everything he had learned, everything he had become, into a simple assessment of his current state of being. He paused for a long moment, looking up at the studio lights, as if gathering thoughts from somewhere beyond the immediate conversation. The cameras captured every nuance of his expression, the slight smile that began at the corners of his mouth, the way his eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the physical space of the studio, the peaceful settling of his shoulders as he prepared to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a peace that seemed to encompass everything he had experienced and learned. He said simply that he was happy, not because everything in his life was perfect, but because he had learned to find joy in the process of growth, rather than just in the achievement of goals. Observers could see genuine contentment in his expression, the kind of satisfaction that comes not from external validation, but from internal alignment between values and actions. He described waking up every morning with the freedom to choose how to use his time, how to serve his family, how to contribute to something larger than himself. The happiness he described wasn't the temporary high of winning a championship, that rush of adrenaline and triumph that fades within hours or days. Instead, it was the sustained satisfaction of understanding that love for family, for work, for the process of becoming better was the only currency that really mattered. Those watching could see him connect his basketball career to his current life in a way that honored both, without being trapped by either. He gave everything to basketball, and basketball had given him everything he needed to become the man he was in that moment. The lessons about discipline, resilience, and working with others toward common goals had made him a better father, husband, creator, and human being. But perhaps most significantly, he expressed his belief that the best parts of his story were still being written, not the basketball chapters. Those were complete and honored, but the chapters about fatherhood, creativity, mentorship, and using whatever time he had left to help others discover their own extraordinary potential. The audience rose in spontaneous applause, recognizing that they had witnessed something profound, not just reflection on past achievements, but a vision of purposeful living that transcended sports, fame, or any specific career. The man who had once been defined by his relentless pursuit of basketball perfection had evolved into someone who understood that the greatest victories happen in moments of connection, growth, and service to others. When the cameras stopped rolling, those present observed Kobe lingering in the studio, taking time to speak with audience members, signing autographs for children, sharing brief conversations with people who had been moved by his words. There was no rush, no sense that he had somewhere more important to be. He was fully present, fully engaged with the moment and the people in it, embodying the transformation he had described rather than just talking about it. In the weeks that followed, his interview with Oprah would be remembered as one of his most reflective and hopeful public statements, a roadmap for how athletes and other high achievers might successfully transition from external validation to internal fulfillment, from individual achievement to collective service. When Kobe Bryant died in a helicopter crash just 2 months later, along with his daughter Gianna and 7 others, the interview took on additional significance as evidence of the man he had become and the father he had chosen to be. His words about finding happiness in growth rather than achievement, about using his platform to serve others, about the importance of being present for family moments, became part of the foundation for how his legacy would be understood. The interview became a touchstone for discussions about transformation, purpose, and the possibility of finding meaning beyond the roles that initially define us. It reminded viewers that the most successful transitions happen not when we abandon our past achievements, but when we use them as foundations for new forms of service and growth. The Mamba's last interview revealed not just a retired athlete, but a man who had learned that true greatness lies not in what you achieve for yourself, but in what you help others discover about their own potential. Observers could see that he had found more fulfillment in teaching Gianna how to play basketball than he had in winning championships, more joy in reading bedtime stories to his daughters than he had in hearing crowds chant his name. The boy from Philadelphia who had dreamed of basketball greatness had become a man who understood that the greatest dreams are the ones you help others achieve, that the most lasting legacies are written not in record books, but in the hearts and minds of people who were encouraged to pursue their own version of excellence. Because someone believed in their potential, he had learned to value growth over glory, connection over competition, love over legacy. His truth, visible to all who watched that final interview, was that he had finally understood that the best victories are shared ones, that the most meaningful achievements are measured not in trophies, but in the lives you touch, the growth you inspire, and the love you give and receive in the ordinary moments that make up an extraordinary life. The Mamba had completed his transformation from predator to protector, from competitor to mentor, from someone who conquered the world to someone who taught others how to conquer themselves. And in that final conversation with Oprah, under the golden lights of the studio, with his hand resting peacefully over his heart, he had shown the world what it looked like when someone finally found the peace that comes from aligning your actions with your deepest values. The legend would continue, not in highlights or statistics, but in every person who learned from his example that excellence is a way of living, that mentorship is the highest form of leadership and that the greatest victories happen when you help others discover they are capable of more than they ever imagined possible. The memory of that final interview would replay countless times in the months and years that followed his death. Viewers would return to it, seeking understanding, comfort, and inspiration. They would analyze his words for hidden meanings, search his expressions for signs that he somehow knew this would be his last major conversation with the world. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of the interview wasn't anything supernatural or prophetic. It was simply the documentation of a man who had completed the most important journey any human being can make. From achieving for oneself to serving others, the boy who had learned to dribble on cracked asphalt in Philadelphia had become a man who understood that the highest form of success wasn't personal accomplishment, but personal transformation. He had learned that true legacy isn't measured in what you accumulate, but in what you contribute. Not in what you win, but in what you teach others to discover within themselves. In the end, Kobe Bryant's greatest achievement wasn't scoring 81 points in a single game or winning 5 championships or earning 18 All-Star selections. His greatest achievement was becoming the kind of person who could sit across from Oprah Winfrey and speak with complete honesty about growth, love, fear, and happiness without needing to defend, justify, or promote anything other than the simple truth of what he had learned about living a meaningful life. The Mamba mentality had evolved from a philosophy about dominating opponents to a way of approaching every aspect of life with curiosity, dedication, and service to others. And in that final interview, under the golden lights of Harpo Studios, with his hand resting peacefully over his heart, Kobe Bryant had shown the world what it looked like when someone finally understood that the greatest victories are the ones that help others believe in their own extraordinary potential. That December evening in 2019, as the studio lights dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling, no one could have known they had just witnessed the final chapter of one of sport's most compelling transformation stories. But somehow, in the way that only the most meaningful conversations can, it felt complete.